Good afternoon. The title of the presentation of Peter was Financial Data Standardization. The title for my presentation is Chemical Data Interoperability. We didn't coordinate on the titles, but I think this shows that this panel already serves a purpose, which is to compare side by side different sectors on how different sectors have been dealing with the same problem, which is how to interoperate. It's the first time that ECHA participates to SEMIC, so I think the topic of chemical data is quite new for this audience. And that is why I will take you there step by step. So chemical data interoperability, I will first put the context about chemical sector, a bit of background, talk about chemical data. The chemical sector is very much data-driven and information-driven, and we'll look into that to finally arrive to the question of interoperability. How do the industry regulator interoperate on the chemical sector? So, because SEMIC is a conference about semantics, I was curious enough to ask one of these search engines, a semantic search engine like answerthepublic.com, what questions could be asked about chemicals. And out of the multiple answers possible, I found these interesting questions. Who regulates chemicals? Who classifies the chemicals? Do chemicals cause a problem for public health? Who does the risk assessment for those chemicals, etc., etc.? All of these questions are the center of interest for the European Chemicals Agency, which is the central regulatory body in the European Union and implements the key legislation on industrial chemicals and biocides in Europe, which are REACH, Registration, Evaluation, and Authorization of Chemicals, CLPs for the classification and labeling, BPR for biocides, and PIC for all the chemicals being imported in the EU. But REACH is, I would say, the mother of all the legislation on chemicals in Europe. And REACH has implemented a principle which is the burden of proof on the industry. Before REACH existed, it was the regulator who had to demonstrate that chemicals were unsafe. With REACH, so when REACH was introduced in 2007, it is the industry, the company producing the chemicals, who have to demonstrate that the chemical is safe and how it has to be used to be safe. So the road of REACH was paved with a number of milestones. There were registration deadlines in 2010 for the highest tonnage band, 100 tons of chemicals produced had to be registered. And then in 2013, we were aiming at the mid-range chemicals, up 10 tons. And finally, in 2018, the low-volume substance, so up to 1 ton, all those chemicals had to be registered with ECHA. And what does this mean? The last deadline has been reached end of May, so a few days ago. And it means that today we have registered more than 20,000 substances in Europe. And the EU owns the largest database of public data on chemicals in the world. And the authorities, the Commission, the Member States, are applying the regulatory instrument available on those chemicals to make them safe. So this chemical database, chemical data, when you look at it, you can look at it from two perspectives. From the industry, it is the companies producing chemicals who have to gather and collect the data on the risk, on the hazard, on the properties, on the use, and they have to assess the risk and they have to propose mitigation measures and safety measures. So that's the role of the industry. The role of the regulator, in this case ECHA, it is to provide, and it is embedded in our legal mandate, it's Article 111 of the REACH regulation. ECHA has to provide an open standard for the submission of this data and had to provide tools free of charge for the industry. And this is Euclid. And because this was written in the DNA of REACH already 10 years ago, all the dossiers which have been submitted in the last 10 years have been in the Euclid format. So we were talking earlier about governance, and in many presentations about how do we govern those ontologies, those core vocabularies, to keep them updated. Well, the governance of Euclid, it's made thanks to the OECD. Euclid was initially a project led by GRC, and the OECD has an expert group who defines, who governs the data format. In concrete terms, they publish harmonized templates. The role of ECHA as a software powerhouse is to develop Euclid and maintain it in different versions on premises or in the cloud, and to make it available to serve it to the industry. So the Euclid format implements the harmonized templates, and you can see, you can probably not read from here, but it sets all the chemical properties and attributes that needs to be reported according to the legislation by industry. Once the industry submits the information, Euclid allows the authorities to enrich this data, annotate it, comment it, and send this feedback back to the industry. So the notion of messaging that was discussed also this morning is also supported by Euclid. So what we can say today, and this has been one of the achievements of REACH, is that REACH has allowed to fill the data gap. The known that we had on the chemical hazard has now been filled. And this is thanks to all of this data submitted to REACH. This data, when it enters ECHA, it follows what we call a data value chain. It is first being prepared, generated, and for that there is Euclid, but there is also a number of tools in the ecosystem of Euclid. The QSA toolbox is here to fill this data gap and also group substance in order to reduce animal testing. KESAR is another application which allows a company to make their chemical risk assessment. Once the data is ready to be submitted, we have a number of transactional systems in the line of the usual e-government paradigm that allow us to collect this information. REACH IT for REACH, R4BP for biocide, EPIC for the imported substances. And all of this data is integrated in our platforms, aggregated. We use text analytics mainly to perform screening, because the purpose of the regulation is to aim at the substances that matter, the most critical ones. So we apply text analytics on this data in order to identify the substance that the regulator has to focus on. And finally, the data has to be disseminated, because this is also an obligation under REACH, that we have to disseminate all the raw data which has been submitted. And in order to do that, we have to extract the confidential business information protected by intellectual property. And we also publish this on the similar dissemination site of the OECD, the ECHA portal. So now we come to the topic of interest for SEMIC, chemical data interoperability. And I wanted to find a working definition for interoperability. Maybe because I have a background as telecom engineer, I like this definition, which is from the telecom package. The telecom package makes a link between interoperability and the freedom of choice of the user. So I asked myself, okay, what is the freedom of choice for the industry? Well, industry has to comply in Europe, but they also have to comply elsewhere. So if we provide them a tool that provides the information in a compatible way for the countries who have adopted the OECD harmonized template, they can reuse the same information on safe cost. REACH also implements a process which is called data sharing, meaning that if several companies produce the same substance in the EU, they have to submit the dossier together. And this allows reducing cost. It also reduces animal testing. So the sharing of information among EU companies is enabled thanks to this harmonized template. Companies, they also need to communicate with the supply chain. Those chemicals are used to manufacture products, and those manufacturers need to be informed about the proper use of the chemicals. So tools like ECHA are supporting what we call use maps. And industry, they want to do all of that protecting their intellectual property. So there is a number of features of filtering which are enabled so that we do not disclose confidential information. On the side of the regulator, well, I wouldn't talk about choices because we, as regulator, we have legal obligations, so it's not really choice the right word. But we have a number of things we have to do. We have to collect the submission in an electronic format. With the volumes we process, it's the only way. We have to do the screening so that we can orientate the member states in their regulatory work toward the substance that really matter. We have to disseminate on our website all this information, all in an automated process. And also, as a regulator, the EU is also collaborating with other jurisdictions who are developing their chemical management programs. So if you look at this slide, you see the ecosystem that surrounds Euclid of different applications who implement those harmonized templates. So you see that Euclid is able to talk to the OECD ECHA portal. It is also compatible with the GSTS standard, which is of interest for EFSA, for the food safety sector. And there is also a number of tools like the QSAR toolbox or ECHA, which I've mentioned earlier, who are interconnected with Euclid. So what capabilities Euclid offer in order to support this interoperability? Well, we have a number of public APIs, data extraction, a provider agent to connect with ECHA portal, and also a number of features of filtering in order to keep the confidential business information confidential. But Euclid is also built in a way that it can be configured and customized for the different needs, in particular the different needs of the jurisdictions and the regulations. We have a number of features to configure templates with a template manager, configuration files, and also customized reports. If you look at this picture, you see the logical structure of the data in Euclid. And you see that on the first tier at the top, you have the OECD harmonized templates. In order to change those templates, this needs to be agreed by the OECD. So this needs to be agreed among all the participating institutions. This happens also for the Euclid core. However, if you look at the lower tier of this structure, you will see that each jurisdiction who implements Euclid can customize its own implementation, its own business rules, and specificities of the jurisdiction. So you have the European Union, who has implemented REACH, but also Biocide and CLP. And you see here that Australia and Canada are having projects to implement Euclid as well in their jurisdictions. So to summarize, you see that the OECD harmonized templates has been, for the chemical sector, the key enabler to allow the standardization and interoperability of data among the actors, among the legislations and the jurisdictions. A number of tools could be developed, and I can say that there are ongoing projects with other jurisdictions like the US EPA and Canada to share more data, the data that is available in each jurisdiction, and that Euclid is at the center of this discussion. So maybe as a conclusion, in order to open a bit this presentation, you have seen that Euclid here has been core in the success of REACH, but this can be extended, and we are discussing with other institutions like EFSA or like the ISA board into looking at the possibilities to develop core vocabularies on chemicals, because publishing open data and publishing linked data on chemistry would require to add the semantic layer, which is currently not existing, and would add even more interoperability with sectors or institutions who are not using Euclid at the moment, and people who want to reuse this data, which is being published currently on the dissemination website.